Hello everyone, it's me, and I'm back with another video. Hope you're having a great day, by the way. Thanks for tuning in. And today I'm going to be talking about the 8-function model. By the way, I'm in my dorm. It's a beautiful dorm. It's a bit messy though. It's a bit messy, but it's a great day. I could have done this outside low-key, but you know what? I'm doing it inside. It's cool. It's 8-function model. Before I start, do a bit of a preface. This video is going to be probably on the longer side. I'll try to leave some timestamps or something if that's even possible on Instagram, but no guarantees. But I think like 15 minutes or so. It's not that long. I want to talk about the science in terms of learning first, before you even hear anything about it. This science has got a lot of flack, I'll be honest with you. And it's not like mathematics. I think that's the key reason why. It's not so concrete as mathematics, but it's not so ridiculous as, well, I'm not going to say ridiculous, but not as without proof as religion. It's somewhere in between faith and science, somewhere between faith and truth. And I would say it's relatively closer to the scientific part. It's just, there is no equation where 1 + 1 = 2. If you think about mathematics as 1 + 1 = 2, this science is like 0.5 plus 1.5 = 2. Or somebody else would be like, 1.2 plus 0.8 = 2. But it still equals 2. They just got there in different ways because they understand it in different ways. Because this whole science, if you think about it, it's within you. If you think about religion, if that's just faith, it's just blind belief. And science is factual, it's 100% true. This is always 100% true, but you have to find it within you. It's not like somebody else can just show you a white paper and then you'll be like, proven. It's more like somebody will give you the evidence, somebody will give you the research, and it's worked for millions of people. And you look within yourself and you're like, this thing I was unaware of, was in my unconscious, now it's conscious and I'm aware of what I was unaware of. True, because it's within you. It's kind of up to you to prove it. But that takes a lot of self-internalization. It takes a lot of self-proving, and you have to talk to others about it. And that's the process that I had, and that's the process I'd recommend. That's the way you should think about it. What is the 8-function model? 8-function model actually came from John Beebe, not Carl Jung. Carl Jung came out and said that we have 4 sides to our mind. We don't live as one. We actually we're fragmented in different personality types in our mind. I remember Jung's quote. It was an amazing quote, I think. He said that through his studies of psychological type, he saw that type determines and limits our perception. And I think that's beautiful, the way he words that, determines and limits. Determines in the sense that we have no choice in the matter, and limits in the sense that it literally places limits on us in terms of what we can do, because no one's perfect. Everyone has weaknesses, and everyone has different weaknesses, and those are kind of our inbuilt limits. I'm not saying we can't work on them and surpass them, but it kind of places that on us from the get-go. So Jung came up with 4 sides of the mind. And the problem is that if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, we've got 4 sides to our mind, what are you supposed to do with that? There's like basically nothing you can do with that. It doesn't make any sense. And there's nothing you can grab onto to actually make sense of it. How are you going to make the unconscious conscious if somebody goes up and tells you that? You can't. And then John Beebe comes up with the 8-function model. And the 8-function model is essentially a way of classifying the different sides of our mind and a framework to understand how the different sides of our mind work. And suddenly it all comes together that we have different sides to our mind, but then we also have the 8-function model to help us understand how those sides work. And then suddenly it becomes a lot more concrete. It becomes a lot more tangible and something that you can actually look at. So now diving into the 8-function model, it's a bit of a ramble at the start. The 8-function model, think of your body as a radio tower, and you're just receiving signals. You're receiving wavelengths of perception. It's not about what your hobbies are, what your interests are, what subjects you like. imagine yourself walking through this earth, this big radio tower, and you're just picking up signals. You're walking through school, you're talking to your mum, you're just talking to a friend, or you're just walking on the street, and you're just receiving signals, wavelengths of perception that are not related to the tangible. For example, if you see on the ground that the grass is green, that's a physical thing you see, and everybody sees that. But wavelengths of perception is a little bit different. If you walk into a room and you see somebody and you know that their feelings are hurt, that's a wavelength of perception, right? If you walk into a room and you see somebody who's uncomfortable, that's a wavelength of perception, right? If you walk into a room and you're a public speaker and you can read the energy of the room, that's a wavelength of perception, right? So it's these human wavelengths of perception. And these are what the 8 cognitive functions are. And they're stacked up in our mind in a specific order, which essentially tells us what wavelengths of perception do we perceive strongly and which ones do we perceive much less. And that's what makes everybody different on an innate human nature level. Pictorially, this is what they look like. Got my trusty little whiteboard here. Essentially, what you're looking at here is the 8 function model. It's that simple. It's just what's on the whiteboard. So on the left, we have what's called the slots. 8 slots for the cognitive functions. We have the hero, parent, child, all the way down to the demon. And then on the right, we have the cognitive functions. And we have 8 of them. And again, everybody has them in a different order, which makes everybody different. And everybody really only has mastery over these 4 at the top. There's 8 functions and people only have mastery over 4. And that goes back to what Carl Jung was saying at the start, which was determines and limits our perception. We only have 4. So we're genetically limited by not having strength in these 4. And these is what's called in your unconscious side of your mind. That's why it's important to integrate the different sides of your mind, because that's how you make the unconscious conscious and actually become a more integrated human being and kind of break free of those limits. Even though they're always kind of there, you can break free and improve all sides of your mind. But what are these functions exactly? So from the top down, if a function has an I, I'm trying to not block you guys. If a function has an I, it's introverted. If it's an E, it's extroverted. T stands for thinking, S stands for sensing, N stands for intuition, F stands for feeling. And you just combine the 2 letters and that's what it's called. So TI, also known as introverted thinking, SE, also known as extroverted sensing, and that's exactly how you read it. Now I'm going to briefly go over what these functions mean, but just know I could spend 30 minutes talking about every single function. These functions are extremely nuanced, and I'm just boiling them down into like 1 or 2 letters. If you want more information on the functions, John Beebe has a book called The Energies and Patterns of Psychological Type. They published in 2016, which you can read. That's a pretty long read. If you want something faster, I recommend just like YouTube videos. I like C.S. Joseph's season 1 explanation of all the cognitive functions. I think he exaggerates a lot, but it makes a lot of sense, and they're like 20 minutes per function if you want to take a look at them. So TI is essentially logic. Introverted thinking is logic. SE is basically physics, or what is. Introverted intuition is willpower. Extroverted feeling is what other people value. Extroverted thinking is what other people think or rationale, and that's why it's an extroverted function. So if introverted function is logic or what you think, extroverted thinking is what other people think. That's the rationale for introverted and extroverted functions. Introverted sensing is essentially endurance and long-term memory. Extroverted intuition is metaphysics, the what ifs, what isn't real, and introverted feeling is morals. So now you know these 8 functions, but how do you figure out what 8 functions you actually have? This is, by the way, I should have said this earlier, but this is just my type. So this is the ISTP. So this type is the ISTP. And essentially this lettering system is a way of representing these cognitive functions. It's not about the MBTI. Like the MBTI is like, hey, like if you're an I, it represents that you're more introverted. If you're an S, it represents you're more sensing. If you're P, it represents you're more spontaneous, whereas if you're a J, you're more judging. This is not what it's about. This is simply a way of representing how these letters line up, which is why this is not the same as MBTI, but we still have a lettering system because we need to represent these 16 types in a particular way. And just these lettering system was just the easiest way to do so. But how do you get from a 4-letter type to these 8 functions? Now, there's basically 2 situations, and I'll run through them. So the first is that if it's an introverted type, and the second is that if the 4-letter type is an extroverted type. So you see, for the ISTP, it's an introverted type. So if it's an introverted type, essentially the way it works is that your top function is always going to be this. It's going to be these 2. TI, right? And your second function is going to be this middle function, which you haven't used, and the opposite to what the first, like introverted or extroverted was. So if the first was introverted thinking, the second would be the missing one, sensing, extroverted sensing. And that's essentially the top 2 functions. And that's it. If you figure out someone's top 2 functions, you can figure out every single other function. You only need 2 functions because these functions have what's called cognitive access. It's kind of like a Sudoku, where if you know like specific solutions, everything else just like comes together. That's why there's not a bazillion types, by the way. If there's 8 slots and you can arrange them in any order, then there's 8 factorial types. That's like a bazillion types, but there's only 16. Essentially, a cognitive access means if you're one function, it means you're automatically the other on the same side of your mind. So if I'm an introverted thinking hero, that means I'm automatically an extroverted feeling inferior. But this extroverted feeling doesn't go into any slot. It only goes to this slot because it's on the other side of the ego. So if introvert thinks at the top, FE's at the bottom, and they're opposites. You essentially swap, I becomes E, T becomes F, extroverted feeling. Thinking and feeling are judgment functions. They're how we make decisions. Sensing and intuition are perception functions. That's information we receive from the world. So it's the same here, right? It's kind of like you have a mirror and you just flip it down. Extroverted sensing becomes introverted intuition, you just swap it. So boom, if you know if the first and second function, you know every single function in the ego. But you also know every function in the unconscious as well. And every function in the unconscious is just these 4 functions, and you swap the introverted and extroverted. So TI becomes TE, and you just swap it and they just come down, and it's like another mirror where you go, well, boom. Hopefully that makes sense. However, there's a caveat. If I'm an ISTJ, so if it's a P, the first function is the third function in the first, so TI. But if it's a J, that means the first function is these 2, SI. But it still follows the same logic that the second function is whatever one you haven't used, which is the T, plus the opposite of the introverted or extroverted function on the very left here. So the top 2 functions would be, right, SI and then TE. And then you can do the rest all the way down and follow that same logic. So that's for the introverted types. For the extroverted types, it's the same logic. For example, let's do the ESTJ. So before I said, if you're an introverted type and you're a J, that means your first function is these 2. Now that rule is reversed for the extroverted types. So if your first function is a J for an extroverted type, your first function is actually these 2. And then the second function follows the same logic. It's the missing one plus the opposite of this. So it would be the TE as the first function and SI as the second function. That's the logic. If that didn't make any sense, you can also just search up your four-letter type, and then cognitive functions. But just note the test is often wrong a lot of the times. From my experience, the test is wrong like 70% of the time. And the reason for that is because the test is just a test. You're giving it a set of inputs and it's going to just give you an output. There's a lot of problems with that because, first of all, people don't understand themselves. So you're going to put in the wrong inputs and you're going to get the wrong outputs. The second thing is people answer the questions based on what other people would say about them, which messes up the inputs as well. And the third reason is because the test doesn't take into account different sides of the mind. Because you could be on a different side of your mind and you're going to test a different type. For example, in every person's personality, there's actually four sides of the mind, right? So 4 personality types in one person's mind. So how can you give somebody one type? At least the 8 function model, the way it works is that your main type is in the ego. So this represents the ISTP cognitive stack, even though I have the ESTJ down here. So that's how you figure out your letters. The last thing I want to cover is these cognitive slots. What do these words mean? Like the hero and the parent, what the hell does that mean? Well, it's very, very interesting. Whoever came up with these names is an absolute genius. Like, it's so smart how they came up with it, and it means there's so much depth and nuance of meaning with each of these cognitive function slots. So I told you that these functions can change order, right? Like introverted thinking can be down and up there. It depends where it is, depending on which function you are, and there's 16 combinations, but these slots stay the same. So your first function is always going to be the hero function. Your last function is always going to be the demon. Your third function is always going to be the child. That stays in the same order. And each of these functions are named because that's what's called the cognitive attitude of the function. So for example, if I've introverted thinking hero, which is basically introverted thinking is logic, and the hero function is what somebody's best at. It's essentially what they're best at compared to everybody in the world. They're getting 100 frames per second of perception of this function. And they're just using it all the time, and it's super powerful, like a hero, like a superhero. And that's the attitude of the hero function. And when I come across people, it's almost like my logic is heroic. And some people have different functions. For example, let's stick with me for now. My introvert intuition is my willpower. The child function is where somebody's immaturity exists, and everybody has one. That's the beauty of these functions. Everybody has a hero function, what they're best at. Everybody has a child function, which you're immature about. And I'm immature about what I want. And all these meanings are super nuanced. The child function is immature because it's naive, because it's way too optimistic. So the child function is extremely optimistic. The parent function is more responsible. It's where somebody's responsibility exists. The inferior function is where somebody's insecurity exists. And funny enough, again, everybody has one. Everybody has a function that they're insecure about. And you can attack that if you know what somebody's inferior function is and how to attack that. Nemesis function is where your worry exists. Your critic function is where your hypocrisy lies, or what you're critical about. And it's like like what are you personally critical about? The trickster function is one of our greatest weaknesses. It's what we're unaware of. And the demon function is what we don't care about. And that's the slots. Very, very interesting. And last thing I just want to do to finish off, and where the video is pretty long, it's like 19 minutes, but appreciate you sticking by if you're still around, is what use is this? If you're like, if I'm telling you that you have these 8 cognitive functions, why even learn this? What is the point of learning this? Well, there is a lot of value in learning this. Jung said that this places limits on us, and yes, limits in the sense that your ego is always going to be strong. You're always going to get 100 frames per second up here and less down there. But what can happen over time through cognitive development is you can build more gateways. And what happens is you can strengthen every single function. So maybe in 5 years' time, your hero function will be getting 1,000 frames per second. So even though your demon function is pretty weak, you're still getting 20 frames, and that's way more than 0 when you started. And that's what cognitive integration is. And if you get really good at it, you can really improve your unconscious. You can start purposefully leading with your unconscious. You can start choosing your unconscious or different sides of your mind in different social scenarios if those sides of the mind are more effective. You can also what's called ego hack yourself. If you have your inferior function over here, that's where your insecurity exists, you can purposefully take conscious measures to make you feel less insecure about this stuff. Also, the inferior function is where somebody's sense of purpose exists, which is amazing, and you can make career decisions based off that. You can stop worrying about your nervous dysfunction, or you can be thinking about how you can make yourself less worried. And I think one of the things I found really interesting is that your trickster and critic function. Trickster function is one of our greatest weaknesses. We're completely unaware of this function. And we just don't know. It plays a trick on you, but we just don't know. It's fascinating. And being more aware of it is extremely useful. And the critic, I think the critic is a fantastic function to work on. The critic, we're always too cynic. It's the critic or the cynic or the cynics or the witch. We're too critical of this function. For me, I'm too critical of introverted sensing. I'm too critical of my experiences. I just don't think anything I've done is worth talking about. And I need to realize that that's not true. And I'm only feeling that way. And you can do the same for your type as well. So that's the 8 function model. There's a brief overview. I know it's pretty long, but this stuff is just so fascinating to me. And it's so nuanced how everything comes together. It's a journey of self-discovery, and it's fascinating. There is so much more to these functions than what I've shown you today. I could talk about this for hours on end. There's cognitive axes, cognitive orbits, there's cognitive attitudes. Each of these functions individually are just so fascinating in terms of how they relate to each other and whichever slot they're in and how they interact with other people. It is fascinating. And over time, if you master it, you can really use it to your advantage and make amazing decisions and get what you want and understand yourself better over time. And maybe one day all humans will be on this, and they'll make the unconscious conscious, and will be a much more in harmony society. And that's it. That's the 8 function model. Let me know if you have any questions. That's a brief overview. I think next thing I'm going to go about is the 4 sides of the mind, because that's actually fascinating to me. That I just think that's incredible how they named this, how they named the different sides of the mind even. I think it's fantastic. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.